Hi everyone, welcome to today's broadcast from Ciphr. Make yourself heard and make the business case for HR software investment. I'm Catherine, I'm head of content here at Ciphr. Phil, if you could just flick on to the next slide, please. Thank you. With me today are Phil King, Commercial Director, and Adrian Goddard, Director of Sales. Welcome guys, it's great to have you with us today. How are you?
Morning, Catherine, all good?
Yeah, good morning, great to be here.
Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to everyone for joining us on the call too. We'll take a quick look at our agenda before I formally hand over to Phil and Adrian. Today's agenda, we're going to go through why do you need HR software, new HR software, major blockers to HR software investment, how to navigate your procurement process, because each procurement process is slightly different for each individual organisation, the typical key stakeholders you need to influence to get your project signed off and ready to go, how to understand your requirements, and then we'll touch on proving the expected benefits of investing in new software and return on investment. We'll also be answering your questions in a live Q&A at the end, so if you have questions at any time, please send them in using the chat box on your screen and we'll get to those at the end. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to you afterwards, and there's no action you need to take to receive that. So you can share that with your colleagues afterwards or just review it at any time you need some additional assistance. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Phil and Adrian. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
Okay, thank everybody for joining today. Much appreciated. So in terms of this morning's conversation, we're going to do this very much as a sort of fluid discussion between myself and Adrian. I think, as you may have seen on the previous slide, both myself and Adrian have been in the people management solutions HR software market for a significant period of time, many decades. So it's really about us having an opportunity to discuss with you the challenges around procurement, around new systems provision, around navigating that whole process of system selection, building a business case internally, and generally maintaining and moving that process along within your own organisation. And really what we hope to do is, via a sort of a back and forth conversation, is to give you some practical hints and tips and give you some examples of circumstances that we've come across that you could describe, some as which may be good practice and perhaps some not quite so good practice. Now, as we're going to do this as a bit of a fluid conversation, I'm going to try and keep myself and Adrian honest and move things along as we go through. But as Catherine said, please feel free to pop some questions in. There is a Q&A opportunity at the end. What I would also add at this point is both myself and Adrian are more than happy to be contacted separately and independently after today's session, even if you're just after some general advice, guidance, insights into the market, and even if it's nothing to do with Ciphr solutions. So we're more than happy to have that sort of conversation with you separate to today as well. Okay, so
absolutely. So that's what we hope is the key takeaway for you, just some thought-provoking topics concerning building a business case, exploring that journey of creating the most effective business case possible for your organization.
So to kick off, we've got the sort of what is your why and how far does it go? So I think we've got some slides that will give you a bit of background and context to what we're talking about, but again, we're going to overlay that with some narrative. So I think before we start diving into the sort of the key questions, the first thing to mention is embarking on this sort of journey is a significant decision. So it's very much around why would you even be doing that in the first place? Because for those of you who have been involved in these sorts of projects in the past, that there is pain involved. There's time, there's resource, there's the energy of not only going through the selection and procurement process, but obviously the subsequent implementation as well. You sort of speculate to accumulate, so it's about achieving some long-term objectives, but ultimately there's going to be a significant amount of work involved. So it's about thinking about why you're going to embark on this journey in the first place. Now, before I sort of throw a couple of questions at Adrian, one thing that we were both quite keen to emphasize at the outset is that a business case is not a one-shot deal. I think we come across lots of circumstances where we're talking to organizations where there is a perception that a business case is a document, a business case is a one-time presentation, whether it's to senior leadership teams, boards, whatever it may be. And I think we were quite keen to emphasize that really you should be thinking about a business case as an evolving process. And it is about making sure that as you go through that process, you're refining it, you're re-qualifying it, you're gathering the appropriate collaboration and input throughout the various stages, which does mean that if you do get to that stage of having to make a specific presentation or put together a specific paper, that the vast majority of the work is done and you've given yourself the best opportunity to move things along smoothly. So one thing I did want to mention, and myself and Adrian were really keen to get across, was don't think about a business case as being that one-time activity. Secondly,
but just before you move on from that, Phil,
yeah,
just like the why is just, it's absolutely key, right? And not to take anything away from Simon Sinek's book, and he's not endorsing this, but the book Start With Why. That why is absolutely key. It's an excellent one-liner for the foundation of this conversation. The question is, what is the depth? What is the width of your why? How poignant is your why? What is the level of impact that your why is going to have? And like Phil stated, that why is going to be a journey. That why is going to grow arms and legs, but the depth of it is really talking about the impact, but the width of it is really talking about that community. How wide does it actually touch the business and the organization? Maybe rather than just your own function or just whatever pain points or issues that you're trying to address, but actually the wider business, does it tie into the why for them as well?
And I think actually, as you said, Adrian, that comes to the crux of the point, and you can see the first couple of points on the slide here. The question you will be being asked, whether it's by CFO, CEO, investors, whatever it may be, if you are going to them and asking for what can be a significant investment of not just budget, but also time and resource, you're going to be asked the questions. What is it that you need to do? What is it that you want to do that you can't do at the moment, that you can't do with the tools that are already in place? And they may be tools where previous investment was only provided 2, 3, 4, 5 years previously. So we are going to talk a little bit later about building that case around thinking of your requirements, but at your outset, you need to be thinking about why you're even embarking on this journey, and not just what you need to do now, but what you're going to want to be able to do in the future to align with whatever it may be, strategic business goals, potential growth, acquisitions, those sorts of things as well. And again, but I'm going to ask Adrian a question in a moment about other reasons why projects may kick off. But another thing I was quite keen to get across was thinking about a business case itself. Again, not sure each of your positions within your organization and how your role will play out, but it's likely, as you've chosen to join today, that you may be involved in building that business case and presenting that business case. I think one thing that we come across quite a lot that can be a pitfall is that it gets treated very much as a singular activity. We come across a lot of potential customers where there is a single person. It might be HRD, Chief People Officer, it might be a senior HR business partner, where they very much talk about, I've got to build a business case, I've got to present a business case. And you're putting a huge amount of ownership and accountability and responsibility on yourself in that circumstance. And I think we're again quite keen to sort of get that message across, that where we see the best processes and the smoothest processes is where it is a collaborative effort, where the various stakeholders across the organization have been brought into that sort of big tent, as it were, and that it's not treated as it's one person's responsibility, ownership and accountability.
But I want to play on that word, Phil. I want to play on that word because you said I so many times. Yeah. You reiterated the word I, right? And that's the question. Is the business case I? Or even if it's just not an individual, maybe it's just a specific business function, right? Is that business case I, or is the business case we, right? Because around the business case, besides it being, a written document as it is many times, it's actually, in essence, personified as well. Who is the business case? When we're talking about how wide is it, what's the width of it, it's talking about the relationship within an organization, because an effective business case is underpinned by those relationships, by that internal collaboration, and creating that community is fundamental to ensuring that the business case has that buy-in. So you've got to ask yourself the question, is the business case more of an I, or is it more of a we?
Yeah, and I think, bearing in mind the time we've got today, we're going to move on in a moment, but I think take note of the points that we've got on the slide here in terms of thinking about the challenges, the pain points that you encounter now, because ultimately it's about the value and benefit that you're going to gain from changing your solution. So it is about efficiency of the HR or people team, and how that impacts across the entire organization. I think we're going to be completely biased because we're HR people as well, but ultimately you touch every part of the organization. You're looking after the most expensive asset within your organization, and your touch points are everywhere. So as Adrian has mentioned, the impact is everywhere and is on everyone. So therefore the value and benefit is to everyone as well. Okay, just before we do move off this slide, you'll all be aware there are other reasons why projects kick off. You may have a new senior stakeholder coming into the organization. You may have merged with another organization, acquired another organization. So there will be other catalysts, other things that instigate projects in the first place. But very much, hopefully, thinking about this initial slide, think about the why. Why are you even thinking about this? Why are you embarking on it? And then it's starting to think about how you're going to justify to the business why that investment needs to be made.
I say I've got an example of that just quickly, just to throw in. You know, recently supported an organization with their business case, and they actually presented it to us in advance, what was being put forward to the board. They presented both quantifiable and non-quantifiable means to justify the investment, but align the business case to the organization's overarching objectives. You know, besides illustrating how their investment will fund and support business projects beyond their own function. You know, and there were some politics, right? And we'll delve deeper into that a little bit later. But there were some politics around certain stakeholders. So they built the case with them in mind to get them on side and gain that consensus. You know, and at that stage when they were presenting it, you know, it was, I'd probably describe it as, it was more like a sales pitch to the board. You know, they were selling this thing to the board to motivate them to invest time into the project and build the justification for the investment, which I'd say landed very well from the feedback that they gave.
I think that's an interesting point, Adrian, in terms of, I think whether you like it or not, everybody is a salesperson in this process, because you are
absolutely,
you're selling the concept, you're selling the dream internally as well, and it's about leveraging every resource you can to support you on that. So I think, as Adrian mentioned, I think it's very much about the providers, the partners you may be talking to, you use their expertise, use their advice, use their support, play things into them, use them as part of the process. Make sure that if you are having to do any form of formal presentation, maybe part of that formal presentation needs to involve the shortlisted or selected preferred provider to actually present. Get them to help you build a business case, and that could also involve sort of building quantifiable outcomes in terms of, we believe we're going to save this amount of money, for example, during our onboarding process, by speeding time to productivity, by reducing admin not only for the people team but also for central IT. So I think that's a really useful hint in terms of, again, goes back to that point, it's not a singular activity. Gain support, gain advice, both internally and from external providers you may be talking to. I think moving on to this slide here, whilst this gives a bit of a visual representation of what we do here at Ciphr, I think really what we were looking to articulate here was more around, again, thinking about that holistic view across your organization. And we've got touch points on here around the fact that everything in that employee life cycle, from initial talent attraction and hire through onboarding, and everything through central HR, but then learning deployment, payroll, finance, content management and integration to other systems plays into the mix. So I think it's coming back to the point really of thinking about the impact on other parts of the organization. So
absolutely, yeah.
So I think we're sorry, Adrian.
No, I say that you're playing into the width here, because like you're saying, right, the business case initially might be as simple as a centralized HR solution, or maybe HR and payroll, but actually considering the kind of portfolio of whoever you're trying to work with, actually how can more of those touch points engage with different areas of the business, especially the key stakeholders that are going to be involved in this business case. And actually, if though it might not be a part of the initial scope, and this is what we're talking about, growing arms and legs, right, and the evolution of the business case, if it supports the buy-in of other people and has the desired outcome for the impact you want on the organization, it's worth having that open-minded view instead of maybe the kind of singular scope as to what's set out initially within that business case.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point, because you need to gain the buy-in. You need to think about the holistic nature of what you're doing. So as you've quite rightly said, if you are looking at the example of you're going to implement a new HR system that you can then integrate to other platforms across the organization, that's going to benefit those disciplines, those functions. It's also going to benefit your IT and your technical teams. You're reducing data duplication, you're improving data accuracy and integrity, those sorts of things. So interestingly, there's that point about looking at the bigger picture, but conversely, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here, conversely, there's the maintain control angle. So I'll give you a bit of an example. Working with a potential customer 15, 18 months or so ago, where we had engaged with them early on in their process. We had held several meetings, gone through products. They'd done it with a number of providers to get to a shortlist. They really liked what they saw. We had good dialogue. We felt we were a strong fit, but they'd always made it clear that they would be going to full tender. So they'd be going out to a formal tender process that was being written and put together in conjunction with other teams across the organization, including procurement. And interestingly, when the tender came out, it bore no relation to any of the conversations that we'd had with the people team, with the HR team during our early stage dialogue, which was really interesting. And on playing that back to the organization, the response that we got was procurement got carried away. So they've written a bunch of stuff that actually we don't really need. We don't anticipate needing, we don't anticipate wanting, but they've run off around the business and they've built something that's now, I mean, you talked about things growing arms and legs, that's now taken this beyond where we want it and need it to be. And the challenge with that then is you're introducing complexity, challenges, constraints, risks to the project that suddenly stalled, delayed the project. And interestingly, in the end, after about a 3-month stalled process, they rewrote their entire tender so that it more accurately reflected what their original scope had been. So I think in terms of this slide here and thinking about scope of your project, I think it's critical to think about the wider impact and implications of what you're looking to achieve and the value and benefit it brings across the whole organization. But you've also got to maintain a level of control. I mean, would you think that's fair?
I guess, yeah. I think what you're depicting there is, in essence, building the business case with a level of flex, but not so much that it breaks it. I think that's probably where we're going with that one.
Yeah. So I think don't stay in your bubble. Don't keep insular of just thinking about your immediate team. Think about the wider organization, because it will certainly help with the investment case, but also maintain control. I think that is critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we move on, I think this is a key one, obviously, the blockers. So I think probably the best way to look at this, as you can see, we've got a bunch of things on here. We're not going to run through each of them in detail because we don't really have the time today. But I think what would be useful, Adrian, is if I can throw it over to you for you to pick out 2 or 3 that you want to focus on, and then I'll chime in after.
I'd say, if anything, judging from this list, I'd probably say my top 3, the blockers that I probably see more times than not, or the ones that are the most significant issues are budgeting cost. Absolutely, money is regularly an issue. Internal politics, which I think is an interesting one, and we've been talking quite a bit already about the relationship aspect of building the business case. That's really working on politics. And then the internal procurement process. What is the actual process flow for that organization in how they buy? All right. So budgeting costs. When I think about budgeting costs, in simple terms, me and the wife, really big on budgeting, ensuring that we have a budget and we can stick to the budget. We used to have a bit of a running joke that if we wanted to invest in something or buy something off the cuff, what does Mr. Budget say? If Mr. Budget says no, it's not going to happen. All right. But I think it's important in relation to what we're talking about here, because the fact of the matter is that, one, if a business does have a budget, that budget might be absolutely set in regards to there is no flexibility with that. And if what you're looking at goes beyond that budget, it may simply just be a no, right? It might be a case of you're building this business case, but there is no sign off for the budget. Probably find that more times than anything, that there is no sign, you know, we don't have a figure that we're working towards, but we're building this whole case and it's growing these arms and legs and stuff, right? And it's and can we justify that cost? And even if we are given a cost, I think it's important to also ask the question of why. Well, why is that the budget? You know, if we're looking at a level of impact within an organization and we believe it's going to bring that transformation and change that we so need as a business, why are we only allocating X amount to that project if we actually need more to see that desired outcome? And what can we do as an organization? You know, from an internal
on that budget and cost, Adrian, yeah, I think there's a very valid point there around the amount of times we come across circumstances where organizations have been given the approval and authority to go out and look at the market. Go and have a look at the market, go and look at some providers. And what you find then is as a people team, an HR team, you may spend significant time and resource over many months exploring the market, drawing up requirements, specifications and documentation, having demonstrations, meetings, etc., shortlisting, going through a process to get to the point of selecting a preferred provider, but you actually haven't had any securing of budget. And as you said, you may have spent a lot of time talking to organizations that frankly you're never going to get the budget for. So I think that visibility and transparency at the outset of having an understanding of what the budget may be and a justification for what that budget looks like and why, as you quite rightly said, is critical, because otherwise you're going to find yourself going through basically two processes. You're going to build a business case and then you've got to build another business case afterwards. So I think it's early visibility of process and budget is absolutely critical, definitely.
Yeah. And maybe for the individual, it'll be a question of, well, is it even worth building this business case?
Yeah.
I know somebody personally who works in the HR world, and they're part of an organization that's got thousands of employees, and they were told to go to market and look for a solution that's going to help deal with some of the HR processes within the business, right? But the budget was minuscule. Like the number that they were given, you probably get a solution that just literally holds records. You know, it won't do anything, because the amount of money that you've been given for the impact that you're wanting to see doesn't correlate, right? I think you're right. That needs to be understood and really justified.
And just one final point before you move on to the next one, just on budget and cost. Again, quite a common circumstance is coming across organisations where they may be in dialogue with us, and we may quite rightly say to them, can we ask who else you're talking to? Because we're obviously trying to gain intelligence. We're salespeople. We want to know who we're up against, as it were. And they may articulate back 3 or 4 providers where we know that the 3 or 4 providers that they have mentioned to us range from £7,000 or £8,000 a year to £500,000 a year in terms of annual subscription fees, which again, it's about organizations doing that early stage research to understand, one, what their budget may look like, but also then around what are the appropriate providers in the market that fit within that particular space. Because otherwise you find yourself in a situation of you're looking at a vast array of potential partner providers, some of which are going to be completely inappropriate in terms of budget and cost.
Absolutely. All right, so on to internal politics. I think what's really interesting about internal politics, the fact that what I believe what the kind of undercurrent or the foundation, what a business case is really built on, is relationships. It's that internal collaboration, that consensus. You know, if we were to go back probably about a decade or so, you know, a buying process, especially for a solution like a HR solution, was generally a lot simpler. And you probably had maybe a handful of stakeholders that might be involved in the process. Nowadays, you've probably got 5 to 15 people involved in the process. A lot of that's to do with risk mitigation, but the fact is that there are a lot more people that have to be involved in the organization to ensure they're making a healthy decision for that investment. But dealing with the politics, you're dealing with the relationship. You know, I had somebody that we were working with not too long ago, and they're building this business case, and you know they've got the clear return on investment. It looks like a solid case, should get the the approval and the buy-in. The head of finance simply didn't like them. And it was as simple as that, right? This is a great case. This will help the business. But actually, because there's a unhealthy relationship there, that in itself was a blocker, to that. And I had to try and work around that to be able to justify the investment. But it could be a case of individuals having their own agenda. Maybe they've got mates who are leaders at another business, who they're keen to get them back in, and invest in them, to get them to strengthen their infrastructure. It's not just tying in what are the organization's objectives and goals, and really going in the flow of that, but also the people.
Yeah.
What do the people want? What are these people who are involved in the process? What's their agenda? What are their priorities? What are their perceptions? What's their bias? And actually, how can I form my case around that and ensure that we've got that health of relationship so that it lands and so that I can progress?
And I think that comes back to what we previously talked about in terms of it's a sales process. It's an internal sales process. So you've got to manage the personalities. You've got to hold people's hands and take them where you want them to be, not just in terms of your colleagues who are going to be using any eventual platform, and you need them to engage with it and you need to buy into it, but it's about managing those relationships during the procurement process, typically within senior leadership teams. And that may also play into another sort of identified blocker further down, where changes in key decision makers mid-process can cause pain. You may have spent a significant amount of time and resource on your process, and then all of a sudden there's a new CTO or another senior leader who comes into the organization who may come with their own views and opinions. So again, I think having that evolving business case that you've been building all the way through enables you to mitigate against somebody parachuting in and suddenly just putting a complete stop on things, because the reality is it might be at that point that you haven't built your sort of singular business case, as it were, by that point. Whereas if you've already got a clearly defined case that's evolving as you go along, I think it mitigates quite a lot against that. But we do be very aware of that. I think we see that a lot within organizations where mid-process other personalities appear, and it can really derail a project, either stopping it completely or delaying it.
Yeah, without a doubt, Phil, definitely. And the last one that I'll touch on, internal procurement process. So, I like to ask the question is to understand, how much research has actually gone in to that specific business's buying process. Because if we think about, from general HR leaders that worked with over the last, decade or so, I found that normally it's probably a handful of times that HR leader especially will go through this kind of process, where they've got to build a business case, where they've got to implement a new solution, So but the fact is that you may have gone through that in a different organization, and it might be in the same sector, be a similar size, have a similar offering. There might be all of these similarities, but actually the buying process for that new business might be totally different. So it's a question of how much research has gone in. Do we understand what the most recent buying process looked like within this specific business? What was the successful business case that had been approved? And also beyond that, what were the lessons learned? Because with any given investment, usually there are pains that come along with it, and there are also great benefits that come along with it. So for the stakeholders involved in the process, it's important to do that background research. What are their lessons learned? What are the things that I need to look out for that they will be conscious of? There might still be an open wound from a previous investment, right? You don't want to rub salt in that wound, right? And again, it's navigating those relationships, understanding that there's a written procurement process, and then there's a process that sits outside of that, right? And it's understanding, well, what are the unwritten aspects of this buying process within the business that I need to be aware of, and that my business case needs to tap into.
And I guess actually what a lot of that comes back to, whether we talk about budget and cost, whether we talk about the people and the relationships and the politics, and whether we talk about the procurement process, it's about knowledge being power. it's early visibility and planning. You need to be aware of the steps you're going to need to take and the process you're going to have to navigate. So the earlier in the process that you arm yourself with knowledge around budget, with knowledge around your own internal processes, and as you quite rightly said, tapping up knowledge from colleagues who may have gone through similar projects in recent years, and going through that lessons learned process. It's about visibility, it's about knowledge. That enables you then to anticipate any risk, any challenges, any objections, and it also presents you as very credible in building that investment case. And I think, as you quite rightly said, Adrian, we will work with many organisations where, for some people, it's the first time they've gone through such a process, and it can be daunting. So I think preparation, arming yourself with knowledge very early is a key point. I think just before we move on from this slide, one thing I was just going to mention in respect of blockers is don't just think of blockers as stopping a project. Blockers, of course, can stop a project, but I think even more typically we come across scenarios where projects are significantly delayed, and all the examples we've got on here will delay projects. It doesn't mean that necessarily a project won't happen, but if you're not armed with that knowledge, if you don't quite know what the process is, what you will find is you get to a stage in the process where you feel you've almost got it over the line, and you're going to get this thing, you're going to get this project kicked off, and your team's really excited, you're really going for it, and you suddenly find out that IT hadn't advised you there's a 300 questionnaire that needs to be completed, and finance hadn't advised you that there's 4 supplier forms that need to be completed, and the legal team hadn't bothered to have a look at the terms and conditions, etc. So again, think about the process.
You've got an external legal team, and they've got to justify the investment of that relationship and go for everything with a fine-tooth comb. And that could be weeks, if not months on end. Red lines through everything, right? And it's like you said, it's just especially if you're working to a defined time scale and there's actually a pressing need as to why you need this investment. Underpinning that procurement process from the offset, and like I said, understanding the written and the unwritten aspects of it, absolutely key to ensure that you can meet those milestones and do it in a timely fashion.
And I think to give one extreme example, we're in annual dialogue with an organisation. Obviously, not going to name names; they are a football club, but we've been in annual dialogue with them for the last 5 years. They built a business case 5 years ago. It got to the point of, I'm just getting sign off from the FD, and that exercise has been gone through on an annual basis now for 5 years, and they've still not managed to get their project over the line. And again, I've got huge sympathy for the people team there, because they're desperate for change. But I think what it does emphasize is a lack of understanding within the organization of actually what needs to happen, or a failure in the business case. So again, it gives you an idea of how long these things can drag on for if you don't manage your process effectively, and if you don't have clarity internally of buy-in from the organization. Okay. And the next stage, we're going to talk briefly, and again, time's ticking on. So in terms of navigating the process, I think we've talked about that quite a lot in some depth, but I suppose just to highlight a couple of points on this slide. I think from my perspective, and again, Adrian, dive in if you think anything different, but there is no such thing as a typical procurement process, because the reality is every organisation is different, and that will depend on the sector that you're in, your size and scale of organisation, your structure. I mean, again, if you are in an educational setting, it's highly likely that you are going to have steps in your process that involve governors or trustees. It's highly likely, if you're a charitable sector organisation, that you're going to be going through steps to get sign off from senior leadership and exec teams, but also you are then going to have to go through that trustee investment sign off as well. Whereas it may be very different in private equity backed private sector organizations, where you're needing to get the backing of your shareholders or investors. So processes will be different from organization to organization. And again, Adrian, would you agree with that? Do you think there's any any hints or tips that might support the audience in terms of thinking about that process?
I think, to be honest, it's just that probably the running theme that we're talking about in this discussion is relationship consensus, having those conversations, healthy communication between the given departments that are involved in the process, and understanding, you know, how, like I said, how are we going to get this across the line? Like, you know, so many procurement processes can be assumed according to the sector, like you stated, but actually that's not generally the reality or the entirety of the process when you look at the actual nuances and the culture of a business itself. That's made up of the people. And if you can tap into the people and get that understanding and have that health of relationship and communication, then actually you can all the more be confident that it will be successful. And that's what we've seen.
Yeah, and I think that plays in. I mean, we sort of already talked about it there, but thinking about those stakeholders, there's a number of stakeholders listed on this slide here. But again, using a sort of practical example, we were working with a hospice opportunity where they went through their process. As far as they were concerned, the process was finishing with a sign off by an exec presentation at a monthly exec meeting. But they weren't aware that their actual procurement process also needed sign off by the trustees. The trustees only meet once a quarter, and unbeknownst to the people team, they had just missed the last quarter's trustees meeting, which meant they now had to wait at least another 3 months to see if they could get this onto the agenda for that next meeting. And there's always a risk it can't make to the agenda because it's already a little stacked. So again, they found themselves in a position of, through lack of understanding, lack of awareness, and lack of information provided by others within the organisation, they found themselves in a position of believing they were going to be kicking off a project within a few weeks, to suddenly that being delayed by 3 to 4 months, on top of what had been a fairly lengthy selection and procurement process. So again, back to that knowledge is power. Arm yourself with information. Understand from your CFO, your FD, your CEO, your MD, what is the process? Who is going to have to sign this off? And when and how is that going to take place? And again, we've got the list of people there, but that could be extended to investors, to trustees, to governors. Think about your sector specific requirements.
But I love that, and we did touch on the fact that this is a journey at the beginning, but just as I'm listening to you speak, just visualizing this journey, this drive, you know, the business case was a car, you know, having those, you know, flat, straight paths, you know, having those speed bumps. Sometimes you come up against that wall that you need to re-navigate around. You get those curve walls, you know, that just come out of nowhere, you know, but there's still a means to get to that end destination. You just got to recalibrate. And that knowledge that you're talking about, those relationships that we're talking about, that helps with that recalibration to enable you to get to that end destination.
Yeah. Okay, so before Catherine starts prodding me in the background, where that time's ticking on, we've just got a few minutes left to go through a couple of other slides briefly. I think understanding your requirements and articulating what you need. I mean, again, one of the running themes through what we talked about is you've got to think about the why. And it is the what, but it's the why. So it's not just assuming that everything in your current systems or services is bad, because it may not be. And you also need to think about, in my opinion anyway, think about what is a problem with the tech and the system, and what is a problem with your process. Because again, I think a common mistake is people instantly jump to blaming a system for any of the ills across the organization or the team or the process or the way that data is captured or how information is then managed in terms of information reporting and business intelligence and those sorts of things. So think about what is good. Think about what is not so good. Think about what is good in your processes and what is bad is in your processes, because it's that overall review of process that is critical as well. And going on to the points on the sort of second half of the screen there, goes back to the point that you made earlier, Adrian, about think about the other stakeholders. How do they feel about things? What's the impact on them? What are the dependencies? And
well, Phil, I want to touch on what you just said a moment ago, though, right? you talked about processes, right? You talked about the system might not necessarily be the problem. You know, there's been countless times where, you know, I've met with organizations and the system is the focus, the system is the issue.
Yeah.
And yeah, we implement a new system, we expect all of these outcomes. And many times we do see a number of those outcomes. But what's really interesting is that a lot of organizations change system, but maintain processes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And many times the process is a big part of the issue. And actually, you know, it's a bit like the tail wagging the dog in the sense that many times processes are built around systems. But actually you want your system to accommodate the process, right? So if you are embarking on, you know, this business case, you want to implement a new system, you've also got to think about, well, what's the art of the possible in regards to how we can change the business processes and improve the business processes in alignment, you know, with the change we're trying to bring with the system, and create that synergy between the two, rather than just kind of putting all of the onus on whatever the platform, the software or service is, but maintaining these processes that maybe the organization's infrastructure can no longer sustain because it's not supporting either where they are or where they want to be.
And I think that that's sort of very timely in playing into sort of the next slide in this section where, and look, the Moscow framework, lots of organizations use it. I don't think it's infallible. I think it's a useful tool to be able to set out some defined criteria. But I think, as you quite rightly said, Adrian, I think it's much more about desired outcomes. What are you trying to achieve versus just features? I think we see an awful lot of requirement spreadsheets that have lists of features. I must be able to click on button X and it does this. But it's thinking about the wider desired outcomes and the value and benefit it brings back to the organization. So having an onboarding tool, for example, that yes, can do a bunch of things, but ultimately it's about articulating that in a way that says the desired outcome is that we're able to reduce central administration by X, streamline our processes such that it impacts a return on investment for IT in this way, a return on investment for HR in this way, for finance in this way. But also there may be some intangible values and benefits in terms of the satisfaction of your new employee being taken through an interactive, intuitive, attractive onboarding journey in advance of their start date, which familiarizes them, which reduces their anxiety and speeds their time to productivity as they come into the organization. So yes, it's about thinking of some of the nuts and bolts of what do you need a system, a piece of software to do, and that criteria, but it's thinking about the desired outcomes from value and benefit, some of which may be tangible to be measured, some of them may be more intangible.
But I think where some organizations can miss a trick, because, you know, I've sat on countless meetings like this and heard so many conversations around this. We talk so much about pain points. We talk so much about, you know, what we must have because we can't do X, Y, Z right now. But what we don't talk as much about is, well, what is the actual impact I want within the business? You know, that should be more so what the conversation is. You know, what is my desired outcome, like you just said, right? Rather than I just simply, you know, want to mitigate this pain or want to get rid of this thing. Because guess what? Changing a feature might not necessarily give you the impact that you're looking for.
Yeah,
it doesn't necessarily matter. Maybe if there's more of a focus on the impact, you might actually find that there's a different way to get into this destination than what I initially thought.
Yeah, no, totally agree. So I think it's thinking about the framework that you're going to use. And at the end of the day, it is about, we've talked about this, so we don't need to spend too much time on this. It is about thinking about the benefits and the return on investment. It's why are we doing this? So there needs to be evidence that backs it up. And as we've said, it's plan, it's arm yourself with knowledge and information, document everything and make those numbers add up, because we know full well if we're all pushed into a corner by a CFO who's asking us lots of questions, they will ensure the numbers add up. So we need to, again, present our credibility in understanding that not only what it's going to cost, but the value it's going to bring back to the business as well. And we've already talked about stakeholders, so I don't think we need to labor the point on that, but I think it is about identifying those stakeholders, collaborating with them, getting them into your tent effectively, and then working with them through that evolving business case.
And ensuring that that why has evolved, that has grown, and that has, you know, there's greater levels of depth to it, because the more impactful the why, especially as you come to the end of the project, again, the more likely you'll get that investment.
And I think just before we sum up, this is quite an interesting slide. As you can see here, on average, half of the time of an HR software selection process elapses after a preferred supplier is chosen. So if you think about that, most organizations start the journey thinking the painful bit is going to be finding the right provider and partner. Actually, a lot of the time that's not the case. So if you want to reduce that time that elapses after you and your team have got to the point of picking the provider you want to be working with, then again, you've got to control the process. You've got to understand the process, because that will enable you to mitigate against the risk of that delay, because you can involve the right stakeholders early enough, whether they be financial, whether they be technical, whether they be legal. But this is a challenge that you will have to manage as professionals in terms of maintaining control of the process.
And I think, you know, I'd say, just jump back to that one for us, Phil, right? I think it's important to not be afraid to seek help, right? And, you know, I'll give you a very quick story around that, right? You know, a number of years ago, with the wife and a number of other people, went to Barbados, and we went to a remote part of an island, and we were on a catamaran, and we needed to swim to the beach, you know, to the shore from the catamaran, right? It's probably about, maybe, call it, I don't know, 200 feet, something like that, right? So swam there, perfectly fine. I was happy. The missus was like, get on the jet ski, don't swim. But no, I was fine, hard-headed as I am. So I swam to the beach, right? Then it was a case of us going back later on after we had the barbecue and everything. So I was swimming back. I'll say I'm a decent swimmer, right? I was swimming back, but this time I was swimming against the tide, all right? So I've swam before. I've had this experience before. This was a little bit different though, because this time I was swimming against the tide to get back to that catamaran. And thankfully I was swimming against somebody who's a really experienced swimmer, because I got halfway and I couldn't feel my legs, Phil. All right, to my own shame, right? I couldn't feel my legs. And, you know, as embarrassing as it was, I had to hold on to this swimmer for a couple of minutes to get my bearings, and then continue on that journey to get back to the catamaran. When I got back on that catamaran, I climbed up onto it, and I fell to the floor. I probably about 5-10 minutes, right? Just sat down. And why I'm telling that story is because, you know, you might be a HR professional going through this kind of process. You might have gone through the process before, right? But just because you've gone through the process before, it doesn't mean that as you're going through it now, the business case will be successful. And especially if it is stalled, it's important to seek help. You know, there's organizations like ourselves, for example, and it doesn't have to be paid help, though there is paid help out there as well. But, you know, we deal with this on a day-to-day basis, right? We can support the strength of that business case to get you back to that catamaran, right? So that business case is safe and that it lands. And I think all it can do is strengthen it, add strings to the bow, give you that capability to ensure that that journey is complete, especially considering this statement here. You've put all that work in, you've gone on that journey, right? Just because something has now happened in that process, in that procurement process, in that buying process, there might be external people who can help, who actually know a way around whatever roadblock you're facing, right? Maybe your resource has only gone so far and you need to leverage somebody else, yeah? So I'd say don't be afraid. As experienced as you may well be, don't be afraid to ask for some help, because, you know, that might be what you need to complete that journey instead of drowning like I probably would have.
Yeah, I'd be on the jet ski, Adrian, because I want to get there quicker. So it's before we hand over to Catherine for any Q&A, look, just a quick recap. I mean, hopefully some of the things have rung true with some of you in either current or previous processes. But again, just recapping, identify your blockers that are going to either stop you or delay you. Understand your process, think about your stakeholders, think about the framework that you're going to use to define the criteria for your project, and those desired outcomes, and think very carefully about, if you don't change, what's going to be the impact on the business. Because again, one of the key things in your armory is if you are struggling to get that buy-in from an investment perspective, it's being able to quantify to your organization, this is what could happen if we don't change. And I think if you think about current challenges generally in the world of work, and obviously there's been huge amounts of change in terms of flexible and hybrid working and people's expectations, especially millennials, but also thinking about challenges across all sectors in attracting and retaining the best talent. Think about those as being opportunity cost to your organization. If you don't have the right technology to underpin those things to compete in the market, think about some of those impacts on your business, as opposed to just thinking about, well, we need to save some administrative time over here. Okay.
And I think last thing I'd say on the recap is just a question of, is your why strong enough to not to not enable you to succumb to the status quo? In you just being told, sorry, make the most of the solution you've got right now, and however you work around it is up to you. But actually, status quo is probably one of the biggest issues. But if your why is impactful enough, you should be able to get beyond that.
Yeah, it's that sort of definition of madness, is keep doing the same thing and hope it has a different outcome. So
yeah, exactly.
So Catherine, anything from a sort of Q&A perspective?
Yeah, so this is a good opportunity if you're listening to us live, send in your questions and answers, questions, not your answers, and we will do our best to give you an answer. I think Phil and Adrian, you've given a really comprehensive tour through all of those considerations. I know you guys could talk for hours, not just because that's how you roll, but because you've got a wealth of experience in the sector. What struck me was you mentioned there's this one prospect that you've been seeing almost annually and not getting anywhere. Can we flip that and talk about an example of a prospect who's really had their ducks in a row and been able to make a swift and sensible decision on securing a change of HR software, and what that process might feel like, or how long that might take? Is like a good example of someone who's doing it the right way.
Adrian, are you happy for me to give an example?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So swift isn't always good, Catherine. That's what I would say, because swift can sometimes mean that the right boxes haven't always been ticked either in terms of diligence. I think that's an important thing to stress. But to give a recent example, Multi-Academy Trust with many schools, their process now from initial engagement, certainly with us and with some other providers as well, has probably now gone on for about 6 months, which is a little bit of an average cycle. But they have a degree of complexity, but they've gone through a very clearly defined process of, again, establishing the why, defining the criteria and the desired outcomes, but most importantly, involving all the relevant stakeholders from COO to CTO to CFO across, and those stakeholders have been involved in the vast majority of the meetings and engagements. So in a lot of processes, those people tend to suddenly pop their heads up right at the end. But I think what this organization has done very, very well and very carefully is they've been engaged from the start, which means they've been exposed to all the dialogue, all the information, they've been able to give their input. It's been much more of a collaborative effort. So a clearly defined and documented specification, clearly understood desired outcomes, gathering the input from all stakeholders required across the organization. And that has led to a pretty streamlined process. And it has meant that every stage of their process that they dictated a timetable for at the outset, they have actually stuck to.
That's impressive. And I think it's really important that you note there that Swift is not always good, because it might get you to securing the budget within that financial year and the contracts are assigned, but then you might fall into issues with implementation and ongoing end user adoption.
Yeah, were you clear with what you wanted? Did you get what you wanted? Had you made some assumptions? Did you look at a bunch of systems and they all started to blend into one, so you're not quite sure what you ended up with? So I totally agree. Of course, we're a provider. We're a sales team. Myself and Adrian are salespeople. Swift is always advantageous. But even for us, we want to make sure from a due diligence perspective that expectations are aligned and that customers know what they're getting and we know what they're expecting.
Yeah, because that sets us up for an appropriate ongoing customer relationship, and not one where that might break down or people look to switch soon after.
Absolutely.
Do you sometimes find that people come into these sales conversations kind of like an us versus them, people are a bit wary of the sales teams and maybe there's a lack of trust and you think, oh, they're trying to I'm going to say he's trying to scam me, which we absolutely aren't here at Ciphr, but like there's a bit of hesitancy in like not seeing it as a partnership, and whereas maybe there is potential for it to be more of a partnership with the prospective vendor to reach the right proposal and range of functionality that could be part of your contract.
Yeah. Good. Do you want me to take that one, Phil?
Yeah, you can have that one.
Yeah. All right. So I had a meeting recently, right, whereby it was a number of the majority of them were from the HR function, right? But there was a number of stakeholders, probably about 5 stakeholders, right? And they'd relayed that they'd been burnt before, you know, especially when it came to implementation. They've been, and each of them had all had their own experience of implementing, you know, this new type of solution, right? So it was what I thought they'd executed really well is, one, getting all of these individuals together, them having a conversation and them understanding, well, actually, what were my lessons learned? What were the issues I had in times past? And what we did, like I said, we had to go beyond, you know, the sales function within our organization, and we had to get one of our implementation leaders to have a sit down, a quite a frank and honest conversation with them, and, you know, hear kind of the kind of ugly scenarios they've gone through before, and give them that level of confidence that actually what is it going to look like with us. And the fact is that doesn't mean that it's always going to be rosy and, you know, oh, it's all perfect, you'll not experience anything like that. But the fact is, it's giving them confidence, letting them understand, well, what is the reality of this process? What resource is going to be required? You know, just dealing with whatever they've gone through and letting them know, well, look, this is how we're going to support you. This is what the process looks like. This is how we collaborate together to ensure that this will work. And these are the means as to how we'll mitigate you having those kind of experiences moving forward. So I think for if there are any kind of apprehensions like that within a business, building a business case, it's important to have those conversations, especially with your preferred supplier, get the relevant people from the varying departments, ensure you've got that level of confidence. So again, you're just strengthening that why and ensuring that it can land.
Sure, fantastic. And just to wrap up, if there is one thing that you would want somebody on this call to take away from our hour's discussion, what would be that one thing to like take into their next system selection project?
For me, it'll be as simple as how deep and how wide is your why. If you've got the depth and you've got the consensus, then I'd say that you're in a pretty good place to ensure it can be successful.
I think for me, it's pretty common sense. It's knowledge. It's knowledge. It's plan. Plan it like a military campaign. You're selling this to your business, so treat it as a sales process.
Okay, thanks so much. So if you can just click onto the last slide, just to say, if you are watching live, then this recording will be emailed to you shortly. If you want more information about Ciphr Solutions, you can email us at info@ciphr.com, or you can reach out to Phil and Adrian on LinkedIn. We're always here to help. Thank you for joining us, Phil, Adrian. Thank you for such a full, frank, and wide-ranging discussion. It's been great. We hope you have a brilliant rest of your day. Take care. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.